violent military rule that replaced Mubarak and the ongoing struggle in Egypt has somewhat died down. And I just want to emphasize the struggle itself has not died down, but our attention internationally has kind of waned a bit since February 11th. In November 2011, on the eve of the recently held, or rather recently completed parliamentary elections, revolutionaries from Cairo issued an urgent call to the Occupy movements in the United States, as well as all social justice movements worldwide. And this was a very urgent call that they issued, urging activists all over the world to stand in solidarity with the Egyptian people and defend their revolution until its completion. Here in the New York metro area, a number of activists, mainly Egyptian American and Egyptian expats, mostly of whom were women, decided to respond to this call. And we held a number of successful demonstrations outside of the Egyptian consulate here in New York, demanding three demands. First, an end to military rule. Second, an end to military trials, murders and torture of civilians. Third, the immediate release of all detainees and political prisoners. And finally, an end to US complicity in funding and arming the SCAF's counter-revolution. I also want to add that the ad hoc coalition consists of a very diverse group of activists from all different movements and walks of life here in New York City, from the Occupy Wall Street movement to the Palestine Solidarity movement, students, workers, many different people. And we feel that this is a great strength to broadening the support and the solidarity that we should build here in the US for the Egyptian revolution. But back to Egypt. Despite the brutality that the SCAF continues to inflict on the Egyptian people have returned to the streets many, many times since February 11th, as I'm sure you all know. And in fact, I want to maybe qualify that and say Egyptians have been taking to the streets long before January 25th. They have been revolting in their workplaces, leading workers and women's and student movements for decades, and demanding their political, social, and economic rights long before the most recent January 25th uprising. Tonight's panel is titled A Political Economy of Egypt: Class, Power, and the Roots of the Revolution. We aim to provide a closer look at the roots of inequality, exploitation, and class struggle in Egypt through this panel. While tonight's panel will not focus so much on the brutality of the SCAF's military rule, Wednesday's panel will actually go more in depth into that. It's crucial that before we analyze what is currently happening in Egypt at the moment, that we first gain a solid understanding of the Egyptian revolution as one that didn't occur in a vacuum, but rather is part of a larger continuum of social movements that have been part of Egypt's history. And Egypt boasts a very, very rich history of social revolts that we can't forget. And also not just revolts that we see in the urban centers, but in the provincial cities and in the countryside as well. Finally, the final aim of this panel is for those of us that are involved with different social justice struggles here in New York, in the United States, and globally. I think it's important that we also draw parallels and learn lessons from what the Egyptian uprising continues to teach us. So those of us involved, for instance, with Occupy Wall Street, with the anti-war movement, the Palestine Solidarity movement, etc., it's crucial that we ask ourselves what we can learn from Egypt's very vibrant social movements, especially its labor movement, and most importantly, how this all fits in with the struggle of the global 99% against the global 1%. So without further ado, I'll stop speaking and I will introduce you to our first panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Timothy Mitchell. Professor Mitchell is a political theorist and historian teaching at Columbia University since 2008. Prior to Columbia, Mitchell taught for 25 years at New York University. His areas of research include the place of colonialism in the making of modernity, the material and technical politics of the Middle East, and the role of economics and other forms of expert knowledge in the government of collective life. Mitchell has published a number of essays on agrarian transformation, economic reform, and the politics of development, mostly drawing on his continuing research in Egypt. Some of his works include Colonizing Egypt, a study of power and knowledge that define the experience of modernity, and Rule of Experts, Egypt, Techno-Politics, and Modernity, which draws on his examination of the making of the economy and the market as objects of 20th century politics, the relationship between law, private property, and violence in the process, and the problems with explaining contemporary politics in terms of globalization or the development of capitalism. Please welcome Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Hoda. It's a pleasure and honor to be here and to share a few thoughts with colleagues and with all of you. I was actually just in Egypt for a couple of weeks earlier this month, a couple of days in Cairo and a week or so in a village in the south where I've been going for the last 20 years and where the book Rule of Experts, some of the research for that was based. And I think sometimes in Cairo one can get rather disillusioned, rightfully, about the pace of things of transformation. And I'm not going to talk so much about the village. There's going to be other people on the panel who are going to give a more sort of grassroots sense of things. But just as opening remark, while there's still a military regime in power, in many ways at the level of the village, in everyday life, there isn't, in a way that there really was before. And everyone I talked to spoke about that as the difference that the revolution had made. They didn't expect any difference to come out of the parliament that met today, of course, for the first time, or anything very much that would come from Cairo. Though there's plenty of hope that things might change on a larger level. But the business of not having to live one's life ruled in a very day-to-day sense by the arbitrary power of the security forces has made a significant difference. It's not that they've disappeared, but they're in a much weakened and defensive position compared to where they were before the revolution, and that's still the case, and that was one of the more heartening things about my experience there earlier this month. So, of course, like the people in the village, I don't expect this body that met today to bring about the kinds of social transformations to the more just, more egalitarian society that a large majority of people would want. As we know, elected bodies, elected parliaments, whether here or there or other parts of the world, have a very hard time doing that kind of thing. What we might hope the elections to have done is perhaps widened a little bit the potential vulnerability of those in power. That is, say, on the one hand, the potential vulnerability of the military regime to certain kinds of parliamentary scrutiny, but equally important, the vulnerability of those who have now put themselves forward for parliament, and in particular that significant majority from the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, and other Islamist groups, to expose them to a kind of vulnerability that as opposition forces they have not been exposed to over the previous 2 to 3 generations. In fact, whatever individual vulnerability, of course, they faced to the regime, they've also served as a means of the regime reducing its own vulnerability with the continued warning that the regime was the one thing that stood between ordinary people and some kind of alternative authoritarianism. But what I want to think about then is this question of vulnerability, of what it was that made the old regime, the Mubarak parts of the old regime, vulnerable to collapse, even if so many parts of it are still in place. And what might make those who joined the military regime under this new order and joined it in its parliamentary forms, what might make them vulnerable to forms of popular mobilization? I'm sure you know the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood, and others in parliament, on the whole, and certainly in economic terms, are a largely conservative force. There's all kinds of speculation about deals already having been struck with the military. Never mind with the US Embassy. There's certainly a sense, one can say, in which they share the outlook of the US Embassy, they share the outlook of the international financial institutions, the IMF and others. An outlook that sees the problems of Egypt as essentially moral problems, that sees the difficulties the country faces as difficulties that can very often simply be organized under the term corruption. The solutions to be put in place that have been promoted by the US for a while are to do with those forms of corruption, with making procedures and people more honest, whether from the US point of view by putting in place forms of accounting, forms of transparency as they like to say, or whether to deal with corruption through forms of moral accountability that are the forms of the kind of language and the kind of procedures favoured by those who've done well in the recent elections. I don't think we're going to get very far by thinking about the problems of Egypt under the rubric of corruption. Not to say that there are people who've personally benefited by diverting funds to their own benefit. But a much larger question of how to bring flows of finance and wealth under both domestic and international, of course, under forms of popular control. The issues that Egyptian democracy faces is, of course, very similar in that respect to ones we face here. How to bring the oligarchs and the speculators to account, not just by describing them as and analyzing the ways in which they might be corrupt and putting a few of the largest ones on trial, but by downsizing them, removing them, forcing those who allocate capital to be obliged to invest it in productive and sustainable forms of collective life. Now, I think one could say that the changing flows of finance, particularly the finance from oil, helped make the uprisings of 2011 possible. If you draw a map of the Middle East and color code the countries by oil revenues, you've got a map of the so-called Arab Spring. There would be three colors, one marking the 4 countries with no oil, one distinguishing the 8 that produce a lot of oil, and one showing the 5 that fall in between, each producing a small amount of oil, and in each of those, the production of oil recently declining. Those 5, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, are of course the 5 countries where the uprising, the revolt, first broke out, first developed, and went furthest. Libya is the smallest of the different group of the large oil producers, but where, unlike the rest of that group, production of oil had also suffered a recent decline. So it sort of falls neatly between the 2 categories of large exporters and that middle group of small producers and declining producers where the revolutions and the uprisings spread. The Arab Spring came after the failure of neoliberalism and its market fundamentalism. So if we compare them to previous moments of revolution, of collapses of autocracy, they're different both in cause and in outcome. For example, of the Eastern European revolutions of 2 decades ago. Those revolutions of 2 decades ago had the misfortune to appear as the triumph of the neoliberal project, appearing at the moment of the rise of forms of market fundamentalism, and therefore had the opportunity to become a laboratory for its failures. I think one of the advantages of the timing of the Arab uprisings is that no one can seriously put forward the solutions of the 1980s and the 1990s organized around forms of free market as an answer to people's problems today. Now, the sudden increase in oil revenues in the mid-2000s and then decline in those oil revenues since then in the countries that I just mentioned, the countries of the major Arab revolts, was compounded by the 2008 world financial crisis. It affected each country differently. In the case of Egypt, I think we can identify the exact points of vulnerability, the points where the protest movement first gained its footholds. And do that, look back at the period of the last half dozen years or so, as a means of seeing how movements of finance and economic transformations more generally help create the weaknesses at specific points that a popular movement or movements can exploit. As oil revenues declined and the country 3 or 4 years ago became a net importer of petroleum products for the first time in more than a generation, it's the first time since obtaining Sinai oil fields back at the ending of the Israeli occupation. The free market reforms of the finance ministry under Yusuf Boutros-Ghali helped create, I think, aspects of the revolutionary movement. The privatizing of state-owned enterprises, which I think we'll hear a little bit more about before, was hailed as a model by the IMF. But particularly after the 2004 so-called reformist government came in, it was pushed further, and it was used increasingly, as it had been from the start, by people in the regime to enrich their allies. And but with Mubarak's succession problem looming, these people at the same time, in the finance ministry and elsewhere, needed some form of vibrant private sector from which to challenge the military establishment and make themselves, rather than the armed forces, the successor regime. So privatization was pushed into large industries like textile that had been left alone at earlier phases. The threats to jobs, to retirement benefits, to living wages helped create the biggest wave of strikes and labor protests that the country had seen in half a century. Reluctant to crush the movement as in the past, not only because that might discourage foreign investors who'd be deterred by armored cars at the factory gates, but also because it would hand the initiative back to the security establishment. Those in the neoliberal wing of the regime hesitated. Another reformist move gave, I think, the reinvigorated labor movement one of its strongest bases in the civil service. In order to, as a central part of reorganizing state revenues 5 or 6 years ago, the regime introduced a series of tax reforms. One of the centerpieces of which was a new property tax law, in which the regime would attempt to raise taxes from owners of property and also reduce the extent to which revenues were diverted into property speculation. It was delayed by 2 or 3 years, and it was finally only implemented a year and a half before the revolution. It was unprogressive, difficult to enforce, and again made the regime vulnerable to new kinds of protest. It was indeed the tax collectors themselves who went on strike beginning in 2007, interrupting this effort to introduce a new tax regime, formed the Union of Real Estate Tax Collectors, which was established the following year, became the first independent labor organization in half a century, and led, of course, to a wider campaign that I think we're going to hear a little bit more about, to rebuild a workers' movement outside state control. Now, I stress these points of vulnerability, the textile industry, the tax collectors, in order to try and focus in on how flows of investment, of revenue, become vulnerable to popular protest at particular moments and particular points. Now, in opinion polls last summer, 80% of those who were polled by telephone in Egypt agreed with the statement that democracy is the best form of government. But only 10% of those who were polled agreed that the most important thing about democracy was the ability to change the government through elections or to criticize those in power. Almost 2/3 of respondents to the poll said that the essential characteristic of democracy was the ability to enjoy a more egalitarian and less precarious life. How then do you make a country's oligarchy vulnerable to the claims to a less precarious life? either the military oligarchy now in power or the more democratic oligarchy that in the best of current scenes might replace it. I think the answer has to do with this vulnerability of revenue flows that I've alluded to, and specifically with the problem that's often simply called rent. Now, rent, of course, is the surplus income derived from having a monopolistic control over a resource, land or an apartment building, for example, in the everyday use of the term, but also in the case of Egypt, resources on a much larger scale, like oil wells, shipping tolls from the country's control of the Suez Canal, tourism sites, and other things. And of course, those three things, oil and gas wells, the canal, and tourism, are the three monopolies that provide the bulk of the state's hard currency revenues. Rent is an income, whether it's in rent from an apartment or rent from an oil well or a Suez Canal, that does not significantly depend for its increase on the productive life of ordinary people. Since it's unearned, it's potentially enormous, and it typically becomes highly speculative. Now, the rentier, this problem of rent, the rentier problem as it's been known for more than a century, is usually understood much too narrowly and in ways that don't have much political analysis. The economists talk about it, saying it causes distortions in economic demand, or it frees the government too much from the need to tax its population. These are minor issues. For what large rents, the government that can live off Suez Canal revenues, off taxing the tourist industry, off oil and gas, is what these rents shape is not just government policy, but the degree of vulnerability of a country's oligarchs, the few tens of thousands of households, the 1%, who own, what, a third of the country's wealth in this country, probably more like half the country's wealth in the case of Egypt. When the rich have access to rents, either directly or through the government or through their positions, senior positions in the armed forces and so on, they're free from any vulnerability or need to invest in the productive lives of ordinary people. To reproduce their wealth, they don't have to circulate it through the working lives of a productive population, so their wealth is invulnerable to the forms of sabotage, strike, or protest that advances popular demands for a more egalitarian life or better standards of health and well-being. Now, this situation used to be very widely understood. It was clear, for example, in the original form of rent, the control of a country's land in the form of large private agricultural estates. It was quite well understood that if a country lived off rent in that form of large land ownerships, it was incompatible with a democratic and egalitarian life. In East Asia, South Asia, the path to more egalitarian forms of economy, in which democratic claims gradually became successful, began with dispossessing the rentiers. Not with calls, as one would hear today, for more transparency or more accountability or better designed property rights, but with measures that expropriated the land and gave it to the person who farms it. And that was the foundation of what happened in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, in other parts of East and Southeast and Southern Asia. This forced those who wanted to accumulate and reproduce wealth on a large scale to do it the hard way. Through industrialization, through investing in productive life, through investing in the welfare of a working population, its schooling, its health, and so on. Now, I'm running out of time. It's interesting to think that in a certain sense, in 1952, the last time Egypt had a revolution, that notion of problem of rents and rentierism was absolutely central, not to the moment when the army officers seized power. They thought they were just seizing power of the army and getting rid of the oligarchs within the army, but it turned into a broader revolution, and its center became a program of land reform, of dispossessing not just the ruling family, but of a landed oligarchy. And they pushed ahead with quite a profound social transformation, but also one with its limits. As in other parts of the Arab world, instead of carrying out a transformation that reduced rentierism to by reducing the size of a farm to what a single family could productively cultivate, they left the upper limit at about 100 times that, or 50 times that, 200, 300 acre farms instead of the 2, 3, 4, 5 acre farms one found with successful revolutions everywhere. And of course that problem was then confounded in the case of the Arab world by the subsequent arrival of much larger sources of rent that could be used alongside rent from land, oil revenues, which freed both the military oligarchs and the entrepreneurial class that allied with them from any need to invest in the difficult business of industrialization, and thus in the creation of their own vulnerability to the demands of labor. What's worse, oil rents were then typically recycled into the generation of further rents, especially through the investment in real estate. I think the Arab world tends to face a real problem here that even other large oil-producing countries don't state, which has to do with its ecology, its desert ecology. In most places, most land that you would want to develop is privately owned. Because large capital cities in oil-producing countries of the Arab world tended to be located in desert environments, the speculative land for real estate around them was not privately owned, it was in the hands of the state, and therefore the state was strengthened, not simply because it had access to oil, but because it could then translate oil rents into forms of speculative real estate development that, as it were, compounded the problems of regimes of entire ways of life, built on rents. We could talk more about that, but I think addressing that more directly is going to be central to the way forward. One of the things that I think can be learned from the '52 revolution is not just that the problem of rent was attacked directly, even if not sufficiently, but it was attacked, as it were, from both sides, by establishing, as it were, a maximum minimum. The upper limit was put much too high, but nevertheless put at somewhere around 200, 300 acres of land, and also a lower limit in the sense that when land was redistributed, everybody got a minimum of 2.5 acres. So you got about a ratio of 100 between the smallest and the largest. Now that would have been better if the top limit had gone down to, say, 10 acres or 20 acres and have a ratio, say, of 10 between the smallest and the largest. But what one had was a sort of clear and visible numerical relationship between minimums and maximums. Now one of the movements, one of the principal platforms of the labor movement, of the independent labor movement in Egypt today, has been exactly to produce that kind of relationship between minimum and maximum. The notion that not only should minimum wages go up from the whatever they are at the moment, about they have now been increased to about £700, but they need to be at least doubled. But also that be related by a certain factor to the maximum wage in at least areas where wages are set either by government and some factor. I think 10 is the one that's being called for by the labour movement, which is not particularly revolutionary. I mean, large numbers of institutions in this country, most schools and universities, for example, have about a factor of 10 between the highest and the lowest, between the minimum and the maximum wage. And relationships of that sort, I think, make much more visible in establishing in that clear way that relationship between forms of rent, flows of rent, and how they're appropriated. I could say more about that, but I don't want to take any more time. The only other point I was going to make, which perhaps we can come to in discussion, is to understand that any transformations of this sort are never going to be enough if they happen only in one place, in Egypt, for example. To the extent that Egypt needs not just to carry through those kinds of more radical reforms in the countryside, but also to continue the process of developing industry. That cannot be done other than through a reform that works on an international level, that imposes international standards of labour, rights of labour, and so on, in ways that people have been campaigning for since about the year 1908, and are still not nearly central enough to our thinking about the process of revolution in Egypt. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Next, we are going to have Heba Gowayed, but before we move on to our next speaker, actually, I see some people that just came in that are looking for seats. There are some seats up here in the front if you're looking for a place to sit.
This is our stuff, so we always move it.
Yeah, you can just move it to the floor. King, and I would like to introduce our second panelist. Heba Gowayed is a researcher on poverty alleviation policy and gendered well-being in Egypt. She's currently pursuing her MA at Columbia University's Sociology Department with a research focus on the social costs of privatization policies and the hindrances on access to education in Egypt. She comes to Columbia from the American University in Cairo, where she worked as a researcher and as a monitoring and evaluation officer on the Egyptian Conditional Cash Transfer Program on a team advising the Ministry of Social Solidarity. Heba received her BA in Political Science and Sociology from the American University in Cairo. Please welcome Heba.
Thank you, Hoda. We're set. Okay, so I wanna just say a couple of words about my presentation before I begin. So in the spirit of talking about the global 99%, about the failure of neoliberal policies, my presentation is a case study to show us what it's like, or what the human face of these sort of policies are, what it means to have a system of injustice. And in discussing education, I'm looking at the reduction of expenditure on public sector in Egypt and what it's meant for the 40% of Egyptians living below the poverty line, certainly, which is a growing number, but additionally, many Egyptians, the 87%, who continue to send their children to public schools, which I will discuss. So, the title of my education is What is Education Worth? The title of my presentation, is What is Education Worth? Fundraising for child education in a Cairo slum. So, considering education as a platform of contestation between citizens and the state, but the question that I want to ask is, how do we understand issues of inclusion, social justice, and citizenship for the poorest Egyptians? This study, or this presentation, looks at 162 women who I've been working with for the past 3 years. They're the beneficiaries of a conditional cash transfer program, which is a poverty alleviation program, which transfers cash to the female head of households, family living below the poverty line, in exchange for £200 a month, which is meant to facilitate families' ability to spend on health and education, but it's not mandated to be spent on that. This is a Ministry of Social Solidarity project, so it's a government project. It's ongoing. It started in 2009. It's implemented both in the slum in Ain with these women, which is the first stage of the pilot, but it's also being implemented in Upper Egypt with about 13,000 families and 65 villages. So the question about CCTs, which have been applied in about 40 countries around the world over the past 20 years, is, okay, so the cash makes sense, but are the conditions necessary? And the answer that I'm giving is no, they're not. People don't need to be told to send their children to school. They don't need to be told to access health care. The reason that the women need the cash, however, is because the government continues to not provide basic services. And as we'll see, most of this cash that is transferred to women from the government is actually spent on what should be public and free services. So in the sense, the CCT is the government's subsidization of its own failure to protect its citizens. And it's a violation of a tenet of citizenship, which is supposed to be protected by the Constitution. Public education is supposed to be guaranteed as free and universal, but actually public education in Egypt is in fact education for the poor at what I will show is very high cost. So 87% again of Egyptians access public education, but as this chart shows, the percent expenditure on public education since 1993 and even before then. I mean, this is again also against the backdrop of the Infitah policies of the 80s, the structural adjustment policies of the 90s, which rationalized, you know, so to speak, or is what they call it, at public expenditure, which resulted in the reduction of expenditure on services that benefit the poor and that benefit citizens, and an increase in expenditure, as you know, if you read Professor Mitchell's book, you would know, an increase of incentives for, you know, the rich, for people who want, for example, the new cities and are spending on these projects that do not benefit the poor. So looking all the way until 2011, until the latest budget issued by the Ministry of Finance, we see that actually percent of government expenditure on education has been declining steadily. And so this is even past the January 25th revolution. So this budget, I think, was out in November, right? So, but looking just at this slide, or looking just at expenditure, or the trajectory of expenditure, is missing the point. Because there's a high out-of-pocket expense that is not recognized in any of the statistics, in any of the assessments of expenditure. This is due to two things. The first is cost recovery mechanisms implemented by the state, which require families to pay the costs of tuition, a small amount, and also uniforms and books. But this isn't even the larger costs, and families who receive welfare wouldn't have to pay that cost. The larger costs are study groups and private lessons, which are charged by teachers in order for them to increase their salaries because the teachers are making poverty wages. So we said that the wage was increased just very recently to £700 a month. £700 a month is not enough for a family to live above the poverty line. So there's still a problem with a very high poverty among the public sector employees. And therefore, these private lessons, which are held after school hours, or the study groups which are held during school hours, are pushed by the teachers. Students who don't attend are harassed, reprimanded, kicked out of class, and sometimes even physically abused. So this is a real problem, but the statistics and the assessments that the government has continually refuse to recognize this out-of-pocket expenditure. I don't want to paint teachers as being the bad guys here because they're also, they also need to live and they need to eat. And there are ongoing strikes. The teachers in October and November said, listen, we don't want to do this. We don't want to charge these private lessons, but you've got to pay us. You've got to give us our wages, which the state still refuses to do. So what's the result? The result is that the women in Ain Sira, who are targeted as being below the poverty line, as being the poorest residents of the poorest community, or one of the poorest communities in Egypt, are paying 50% of what they pay on food on private lessons. So they pay about £300 per month on food and £160 per month on private lessons on average for their children. 76% spend the entire amount of the CCT transfers solely on this cost. So we can see how big of a burden this is on women who are already, 86% are currently in debt. All of those who work, which I think is about 45%, work informally. 40% are regularly exposed to violence in the home, which is largely due to frustration over cash, or what they claim is due to frustration over cash. And 80% of families have a chronic health burden in the family. So 80% of families have at least one member with a chronic health burden. The mothers then are forced to work more, are forced to incur more debt, are forced to choose between children. The main reason, as Rogi Assad wrote in a 2007 study, for pulling children out of school is because of finances. So that's the main reason that children drop out and don't have access to education. One woman in Ain Sira, Saneh, had to pull her child out of education after she had been working for 20 years as a nurse at a public hospital, but was not contractually, did not have a contract. So therefore she didn't have health services, and when she got sick, she had to leave work, pay for her own medical care, which some NGOs helped her fundraise for. When she went back, they wouldn't let her back at her same salary, they let her back at a reduced salary, and she had to pull her youngest child out of school. So this is a real, the problem is, of course, I'm only focusing on education, but we could have another presentation on work, we could have another presentation just on debt, on the CCT, so. But the problem, the additional, sorry, I've been talking in two, yeah, great. So, no, the next one. Yeah, sorry, thank you. So the problem with this is low returns. Kids go to school. The parents pay this exorbitant amount to keep them in school, but then they graduate, and even at the college level, and they're getting low earnings, they're underemployed, bad performance on exams is highly correlated with the lowest income quintiles. And this is largely due to a low quality of education. These kids aren't taught to use computers, they're not taught foreign languages, the teachers are unqualified to teach, and there's no sort of monitoring of the school system. But additionally, of course, we could also talk more about what the job market looks like and what employment opportunities are out there, but part of it is a problem with supply. So the question presents itself: why do the women continue to pay for a good that essentially, kind of leaves them where they are and sort of further into debt? So these are the responses from the women. Gowayed is a mother of 5 girls, and she says, even if a child doesn't work with her degree, it's better than not knowing anything like me. Especially if the child is a girl, she must be educated 3 times over. A second woman, Sabra, says, even if I get money, I always spend it on lessons. It's more important than food to me, because education lights up the mind. A third woman, Maryam, who I think is the most poignant sort of quote that I received, is, everything is built for those who are educated. So in the narratives of the women we see, yes, is spending on public education a strictly rational economic decision? No, maybe not. But it's worth it to the women. And the reason that it's worth it is because it allows them to participate in the possibility of a better future for their children. It's a material act, and in paying for this education, they're confirming their hope that they can live with dignity as citizens of the state and be part of this built-up everything that they seem to be carrying on their shoulders but not benefiting from. So in April 2011, I got to visit Ain Sira to do the midline for this research. I could have talked about methodology, but because I know the time is tight, I sort of didn't. But if you'd like to ask about that, that would be welcome. In 2011, I went and visited, and I was told by the women that their health services were cut after January 25th, which is a big deal given the chronic health burden and given that families, they couldn't buy medication, they couldn't get basic services for their families and loved ones. The housing authorities are unresponsive. They've always been unresponsive to this community, but one woman, bless her, thought that they were taking her papers, taking them out to the ocean and dumping all the papers that she was submitting to the housing authority off the boat. And I was thinking, like, yeah, they're probably dumping your papers, but they're not putting that much effort into it. So, the authorities continue to be unresponsive to these women. And fear. The women responded with fear. They didn't like that the revolution happened. They didn't like that January 25th happened. They were afraid of the instability, economic safety. I mean, during the first period of the revolution, from January 25th up until maybe the end of February, their husbands were at home, staying at home. They were out of work. Their children were out of work. So there were more mouths to feed at home and less money to do it with. And they were really worried about the instability. But the personal safety was the big deal. So I was told by the social workers who I worked with when I went back to Ain Sira in April that a fight between two mobile vendors had happened in the area, sort of a turf war. And what ended up happening is that they recruited some of the guys from the area, and then some of the other guys were still out in these el-Shafei, which are like community protecting, leagues. And what ended up happening is that the violence resulted in a lot of the boys getting hurt. And in a lot of trouble for the community. But the military and the police sort of weren't there and refused to help them. So one woman, Menna, said, "The military got afraid and left the area. Really, this is the first time I see the military running away afraid. Only the rich get proper funerals. The poor are trampled over." And for those of you who speak Arabic, she said, which is a sort of powerful, it was a very powerful statement. A second woman, Nadia, who got a group of women together and went knocking on the police precinct door. And by the way, the police precinct is right in the center of the area. She says, "Can't you see what's happening to us? Can't you see this violence?" And the police told her, "We don't have orders to help you." And so what they did is that the police came, a week after all this had happened, rounded up all the boys, the ones who were protecting, the ones who were offending, and then they just took them and left. And this was all they saw of the police during this time, which is all they'd ever seen. But coming in the spirit, coming right after all this instability and all this economic trauma that they had dealt with, it was really I think a very severe blow. So Ain Sira is an interesting place to sort of look at in terms of the impact of social transformation, the impact of the revolution, because it's the first public housing projects ever built in Egypt were built under Nasser in about 1959 in this area. But it's also the site for the failed relocation project under Mubarak in 1992. When the houses were condemned in the earthquakes, Mubarak moved different families to the garden, to what was the garden of the social housing project, in these sort of makeshift houses, and now they're built in concrete. 20 years later, they've just been forgotten. And so a lot of the stories and a lot of the women that were participating were from this area. As elections unfold, now it's sort of really interesting to watch what's going to happen to this area, what's going to happen to the 40% of Egyptians living under the poverty line. While I'm not saying that this community represents everybody else, but from understanding these narratives, we can sort of begin to conceptualize what it's like for the villages, which is even worse, which I worked at, and which are even worse than the case of Ain Sira. So will this community continue to absorb the shocks of transition, or will their voices be heard? And Professor Mitchell just told us that probably not. probably we're not going to have moves towards social justice. And I think the violence that we saw here is reflective of the violence that we later saw recently in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you, Heba. Our next panelist is Menna Khalil. Menna is an independent researcher and writer working between the Middle East and the United States. She holds an MA in International Human Rights Law from the American University of Cairo, and a BA in International Studies, French, and Economic Theory from DePaul University in Chicago. Menna's academic interests in anthropological approaches to language, sensorial mediation, and narrative production have guided her work on translation and forms of storytelling. She has been carrying out ethnographic work on the relationship between citizens and the Egyptian army following the ouster of former President Mubarak. Please welcome Menna.
Sorry, I'm going to be a little shaky because I'm freezing, but it's great to have you all here, and it's great to get a chance to speak with Tim, Heba, and Omar, and Hoda. So I just want to give you a bit of a map out of my presentation today. I'm going to mainly focus on, like Hoda said, mentioned, our next panel on Wednesday will be covering a lot of the violatory kind of aspects to SCAF and what we've seen unfold on the ground in the last 12 months. Since the first revolutionary events took place last year. So I'm not this is gonna be sort of stripped out of my narrative on the army. So most of what I'll be given an account for will be focused on the perception of Egyptians, or more of the place of the army in the national imagination, and how that is a bit of a schizophrenic imagination or a kind of reflection or perception of the army, in comparison to the army being a body that's no longer perceived as a national defense force, but rather an economic dominating force in Egypt. So here it goes. Itself a political instrument of the old regime with Mubarak presiding over the military institution as chief commander for the last 3 decades. Protesters on January 28th received army soldiers quite differently from other state forces such as the central security forces as well as the police. It's important to note here that demonstrators' initial encounter with the army on that day was characterized by greetings, warm greetings, chocolates, flowers, chants to celebrate the arrival of the savior kind of troops that are coming to alleviate the violence that was directed on demonstrators by state security forces. And so in turn, the encounter was not so much, oh sure, can I do something about this? It's a little awful. Or I can just use this, yeah. Sorry, is that better? Okay. So people encountered conscripted soldiers, so day-to-day soldiers that they see in villages and around the city, but not higher-ranking officers that we perceive as, lending themselves to the ranks of the SCAF member, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And so in turn, they greeted people quite warmly and with this kind of personal rapport of "you're of us, you're of the people," etc. And this is also, witnessed throughout the Nasserist era, in which Nasser produced Nasser and many military officers, as well as performance artists, produced a high volume of works around. Around the image of the Egyptian soldier. So in other words, the soldier being glamorous, being one that's charming, that's common to all families in Egypt, and also one that's a guarantor of revolution. In other words, the coup or the revolution of 1952, as well as protector of the nation against wars in 56, 67, and 73. And so that figure of the soldier, at once celebrity and son, becomes familiar and appealing all the more to this common notion of family, and hence the unity between the army and the people in the chant, the people in the army on one hand. But other protesters also greeted the army using these kinds of chants on January 28th and days to follow as tactic. So by way of strategy, these things are used to maneuver or prescribe a kind of dynamic of shaming between the people and the army. So officers, please don't shoot at us because you're of us, you're our family, you don't want to do this, you're not police, you're not central security forces, and you're also of us. You're not outside to us as Mubarak and regime and company have been deemed throughout the revolutionary events. So whether an intentional strategy or an internalized perception, there is collective memorialization of the army as protector against foreign imperialism, and liberator of the nation, as a force having always stood by and guided the will of the people. And so this is kind of interesting when we begin to juxtapose it with the military's place economically and its dominance in Egypt, and how that's also not surprisingly as common knowledge to most Egyptians, especially average Egyptians, in terms of the breakdown of what the military owns, what the military controls, and how that factors into the 99% versus the 1% and labor, which Omar will expand on significantly. So the military's ownership of economic assets, including property and means of production, was established through a series of nationalization initiatives in the wake of the 1952 coup or revolution, led by Nasser and the men of his cabinet. For instance, the 1964 Constitution tells us, quote, "The people control all means of production." And here, obviously, people in the military, especially its high-ranking military officers of Nasser's cabinet, who took the initiative to manage a lot of these nationalized enterprises on behalf of the people, become synonymous. So people, army, it's in the hand of the people, that means it's in the hand of Egyptians, because the army are representative of Egyptians. The creation of the Central Security Forces in 1977, which used unprecedented violence to quash many demonstrations as well, domestic uprisings of various forms, including labor strikes, ensured that the military could retain its image as a protector in national memory. So in other words, it wasn't part of the Mubarak regime's forces or sort of violent forces that detain people and torture them and quash them down when they resist. Also, the invisibility of the military as a war-making body since 1973, coupled with the military becoming the largest landowner in the country, has created a new space in which conscripts' mandatory service is deployed into a variety of labor fields. So in other words, they're no longer needed on the borders in the same capacity, especially with this being sensitive in light of the Camp David Treaty, that they no longer represent this body that guides the borders or protects the borders of the nation, but come to represent other aspects of maintaining old army laws as well as traditional duties, as well as transforming them onto labor services. And so, sorry, 1 second, let me find it, please. So some of these labor fields include factories and construction sites for military-run enterprises, which I'll go into detail in later, in addition to traditional ongoing duties like training and providing service for the institution itself, the army institution. It's also then and during the Sadat era that we begin to see more vividly the transformation of the military from an organ of nationalist resistance and socialist governance to a kind of technocratic class of former officers who often turned policymakers and then became a central arm to the remaking of Egypt's social structure into a neoliberal economy. It was also during Sadat's era that open market economic policies were reintroduced as a means for fostering investment and political interest with the West in the late 70s, beginning with the privatization of state-owned enterprises. And this is sort of an interesting link because this is kind of a bit of it presents itself as a challenge to the army as an institution, as well as its connection with the larger civic body of governance. In other words, the Sadat regime, which became increasingly more civic and less militant in its appearance. So in other words, there's a lot of, you have a lot of military officers that are higher ranking and that are sort of left, and what do you do with them? Do you sort of give them different jobs or relocate them, or do you retire them and leave a bunch, a pretty high bunch that's unsatisfied with this new kind of shuffle? So the involvement of military officers and conscripts became increasingly limited to labor fields. Sorry. Should I please? Okay. Is this better? Really sorry, it's super short. So anyways, so then we move on to the Camp David peace treaty with Israel and also how it impacted the military's political and economic role, as it meant that the potential layoff of, like I said, the higher ranking officers might not be the most conducive to the new formation of the Sadat regime or the direction that it was taking. And to remedy this, the National Services Projects Organization was established, which founded a variety of heavily subsidized and tax-exempt commercial enterprises to be run by those ex-military officers, colonels and generals. And such enterprises were completely unregulated.
So this is the very important factor for later labor strikes, as well as the ongoing demonstrations that are taking place in resistance to the army space, in general, political as well as economic life, versus its role as a national defense force. So in the 90s and during the wave of the economic liberalization and the ongoing elimination of past socialist policies, the military enterprises were basically left untouched, so long as they didn't compete or interfere with Mubarak, as well as his son later to be groomed for presidency, in his increasing project of privatization, especially of public sector enterprises that were previously run by the army generals. So between 2004 and 2011, we begin to see this trend in which retired military officers are now being rehired by Gamal Mubarak and company, who are also owning investment companies that are quite prevalent in this new direction, or the new liberal kind of direction of privatization that the country's headed in. And so this leads us to my second part of the presentation, which is how people encounter army officers, or especially conscripts, and how that begins to really challenge things on the ground, especially as set against the backdrop of ongoing violence with conscripted soldiers versus higher-ranking officers or the staff. And that is, how do people encounter the army in everyday space? In other words, spaces of labor. Given that all information related to the production lines and enterprises owned and managed by the military elites is considered classified, and that discussion of enterprises is criminalized under martial law and subject to prosecution before a military court, there is much speculation over the figures of ownership. So we don't know much about what the military owns and what it manages, and the details that are broken down to sort of concretize those ideas or the information around it. But it's speculated there's about 20 to 40% of the commercial economy is run and owned by the military in Egypt, accounting for about 10 to 15% of Egypt's annual income, which is about $210 billion as an estimate given for last year. So some things we do know about military enterprises that they include real estate through the armed forces land projects, which are sometimes residential, sometimes recreational compounds. Gated communities are residential, which are sort of saved for the elite, the 1% of Egypt's population, including military officers. And also beach resorts along the North Coast and the Red Sea are what are examples of the recreational compounds constructed by the army. There are also construction enterprises, domestic cleaning services, petroleum services and management, livestock farming, food and plastic productions. And as for procurement and co-production of weaponry, I think this is the most transparent of the Army's budget, because that's something that the US has a pretty grave interest in. And the US publishes on State Department websites, CIA website, etc. So that information is all accessible, and it sort of gives you a glimpse in the reality of the Army's economic dominance. So in that sense, we begin to see that the Army has quite a vested interest in maintaining political dominance as well as political appearance, because it would impact its basically the redistribution of its assets economically, which we haven't heard much about in the political trials of Mubarak and company, and haven't really heard much about as far as elections go, as far as parliamentary breakdown, as far as what's being discussed with Parliament. And this brings us, I guess, to a more important question that I was hoping to raise with everyone and talk to you all about, which is why has the military been steering its establishment from its principal obligations, such as protection of borders, production of weapons, training of conscripts, and national defense, and turning more in the direction of management of economic assets and visibility in the political sphere. And so I'm wondering what caused for the overlap between army leaders and corporation owners, and I think this is something that we can sort of reflect on in looking at the US, for example, especially during the Bush administration era, and how we see a lot of the usual suspects between war-making personnel as well as money-making personnel. And how does that impact the transformation of the conscript and his duties and his perception and his interaction with protesters, with people in everyday spaces, especially as we begin to see involvement in labor. So the military businesses, for example, have faced a lot of trouble, a lot of strikes, given the conditions that are not subject to union or constitutional policies for protection of laborers. So in other words, they fall under the auspice of court, of martial law, excuse me. So they're not really dealt with in the same manner. If you're protesting, there was also an incident in the military factory in '99, which is quite famous, and it's in the Halwan district. It's a cement factory, and so it focuses on different productions and sort of exports labor. It shares labor with other factories, but also has horrendous conditions, very dangerous for workers. And it's faced strikes in the past, but those strikes were immediately quashed, and people were put, about 3 of the men that had protested were put before military court. So they're not subject to civilian law. And I think this is something that Omar will go into in more detail. So on that level, there's that problem, and then there's the problem of regulation when it comes to sales. So in other words, the military ensures that its conscripts, which are sometimes, since they're not really being trained for war or for national border protections, oftentimes they're used as free labor, especially in the last 6 months of their service requirement, which is mandatory for all males who don't have who have siblings in their household, male siblings in their household. So in that sense, the males are, they're free labor, and if they do get salary or some sort of compensation, they're forced to sort of use it to purchase army goods that are, provided in factories, etc. So that also factors into the sales, and some sales are also enhanced by the distribution of army products to local distributors, and those local distributors are usually given tax breaks or exemptions, as well as permit extensions for sales or for their rents. Very interesting with the old rent control situation, in order to sell or favor army products. So I guess given that level, between labor, sales, and then my last point that I'd like to make is on the governorate level, which is basically, the interesting point that Tim mentioned in terms of what we see in the city with encountering the army, and also what Heba talked about in terms of people seeing military personnel on a daily basis versus a kind of now a hidden shield or a tricky situation where, out of about 21 of the 29 governors across Egypt are actually retired military personnel. And in that sense, you can see the trickle-down effect from being in control of local politics and moving on to the level of factories that are run locally and across different governorates, especially in the Delta area, given the popularity of strikes around that. So for, such forms of economic power enable a certain kind of conception of social life in Egypt, and especially a very different kind of encounter with the army, which we don't really know how it's going to unfold, especially as elections take place, continue to unfold presidentially as well as in local governorates. So I sort of like to end it there and open it up for